Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. James Hancock here. I'm back to review Wuthering Heights, the latest adaptation of Emily Bronte's classic novel, this time from writer-director Emerald Fennell, starring Margot, Robbie, and Jacob Elordi. And before I say one word about this latest adaptation, no, I have not read the original novel Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë, first published back in 1847 under her pen name Ellis Bell, and sadly, she would die only a year later. And I think I was assigned to read the novel as an English major at the University of Virginia, but because I'm a Cro-Magnon who breathes with his mouth open and drags his knuckles as he walks, I did not read the book. Although I did read the book Jane Eyre by her sister Charlotte Brontë way back in 8th grade, 35 years ago. So that was my only encounter with the Brontë family, apart from the 1939 adaptation of Wuthering Heights, starring Merle Oberon, Laurence Olivier, and directed by William Wyler. And if you love classic movies from the 1930s, definitely take it for a spin. In any case, I can't do a proper compare and contrast between the original novel and this latest adaptation. My understanding is that there's some literature buffs out there who are quite literally up in arms over what they perceive to be horrible, liberties being taken with this novel that they've been studying religiously their entire lives, because ever since this novel first got published, people have been falling in love with it and debating it in their English classes, or debating it in book clubs, or debating it in online forums, because this is a movie about, themes of possession and love and revenge and betrayal and possible reconciliation, but it's a very steamy, turbulent, adversarial, oftentimes very aggressive, lurid melodrama, and I must admit, I liked it a lot more than I expected to going into it. So much so, I actually think it's the best movie yet by Emerald Fennell.
So kiss me, and let us both be damned.
And I'd heard in advance that this was going to be a completely modern interpretation of the text, filled with modern dialogue and pop songs and softcore porn scenes and all this stuff, none of which actually turned out to be true. And to be fair, there's some music in the overall score that does sound more modern than 1847. And there's some very unusual design choices in one of the households featured at the center of the story. But on the whole, it just feels like Emerald Fennell and Margot Robbie wanted to deliver a steamy, lurid movie about romance and jealousy. And I would say on the whole, they were largely successful due to the chemistry between Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. And let me pause for a moment to discuss Jacob Elordi, because I imagine there are a lot of guys out there who are blissfully unaware that Jacob Elordi even exists. But for women, I would imagine most women between the ages of 20 and 60, if they've seen him in a show or a movie, they get a little moist between the thighs when they think about Jacob Elordi, because every time he comes up in conversation, no matter what age the woman in question might be, they get little beads of sweat across their forehead and get this kind of 1,000-yard stare. And a perfect example of this is when I was discussing with my younger sister, who's 23, which male actors out there have incredible star power and sex appeal, etc. And I brought up Timothée Chalamet, and she kind of acted like he was yesterday's news. But when Jacob Elordi came up, let's just say she had quite a different response. And to be fair, it's not just the ladies, because I listened to the film podcast hosted by author Bret Easton Ellis, who, for people who don't know, he's gay. But anytime Jacob Elordi comes up, Bret Easton Ellis, let's just say he becomes very animated in his praise for his acting ability in shows like Euphoria. And speaking of Euphoria, Jacob Elordi is truly in the lucky sperm club, because he spent 2 seasons on Euphoria, basically getting it on with Sydney Sweeney in each and every single episode. And here he is now in Wuthering Heights, making out with Barbie herself, Margot Robbie, who first came to my attention in The Wolf of Wall Street, directed by Martin Scorsese. And let's just say that she made quite an immediate and memorable, lingering, lasting impression when she opened up that sliding door on her first date with Leonardo DiCaprio. But for all the diehard buffs of classic English literature out there, I don't know how they're going to feel about seeing 2 Australian actors playing these quintessentially English roles of Cathy and Heathcliff. And as I was watching the movie, even though there was nothing in the movie that felt or resembled anything Australian at all, I kept thinking about that old SNL skit about Australian screen legends.
Oh, well, look at your boner.
Yeah, I got a boner. Look at your tits.
So I challenge you now not to think about Australian screen legends while you're watching the movie, because I found myself involuntarily cracking up at times just remembering Hader and McKinnon and their approach to that sketch. But let's get serious. What is Wuthering Heights? For people out there who have not read the novel or seen any other adaptation, here's all the information that is fit to print from Wikipedia. Wuthering Heights is the only novel by English author Emily Brontë, initially published in 1847 under her pen name Ellis Bell. It concerns two extensive upland estates and their landowning families on the West Yorkshire moors, the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and their turbulent relationships with the Earnshaws' ethnically uncertain foster son, Heathcliff. Driven by themes of love, possession, revenge, and reconciliation, the novel, influenced by Romanticism and Gothic fiction, is considered a classic of English literature. Wuthering Heights was accepted by publisher Thomas Newby, along with Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, before the success of their sister Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane Eyre, but they were published later. The first American edition was published in April of 1848 by Harper & Brothers of New York. After Emily's death, Charlotte edited a second edition of Wuthering Heights, which was published in 1850. Though contemporaneous reviews were polarized, Wuthering Heights has come to be considered one of the greatest novels written in English. It was controversial for its depictions of mental and physical cruelty, including domestic abuse, and for its challenges to Victorian morality, religion, and the class system. It has inspired an array of adaptations across several types of media. And I find it interesting that here we are in 2026, and a novel that's nearly 200 years old is still capable of generating a little bit of controversy when it comes to the depictions of, on-screen sexuality and cruelty and all the mind games people can play. And for me, because I'd largely forgotten the 1939 film starring Laurence Olivier, a lot of this came as a huge surprise to me as I was watching it. Because usually when a kind of a tearjerker, sappy, like syrupy romance is released on Valentine's Day, usually it's basically what you would describe as like a chick flick, where it's like, very syrupy, very saccharine, and very obviously emotionally manipulative. But Wuthering Heights, it's got quite a few scenes in there that I think the fellas are going to be like, hey, you know what? This movie's not so bad. Like, can we have another date night? As far as date nights go, this is going to be that rare date night movie where I think the girls are going to really enjoy it, and the guys might not enjoy it to the same degree, but at least it's not going to feel like a complete and total waste of time. At a minimum, they will enjoy discussing it after the fact. Because as I'll get to in my spoiler section, there's some scenes between Jacob Elordi and Alison Oliver, who plays the character of Isabella, where I just sat back, I was like, holy cow! I was not expecting the movie to be nearly as kind of perverse and disturbing as it becomes in kind of the darker latter third of the movie. But in the end, director Emerald Fennell has definitely crafted a movie with the ladies in mind, especially in the first third, where Jacob Elordi, he's your classic brute that every girl ought not to fall in love with, but can't help but fall in love with. If this movie took place in the 1950s, he would have greasy hair and he would be riding a motorcycle. But because it takes place in the 1840s, he's always like, out in the stables, stinking of horse manure and chopping wood and kind of throwing his hair back and basically looking like the cover of like a romance novel in the 1990s. For people who don't remember, in the 1990s, whether you're in a grocery store or a drugstore, there would be racks upon racks of romance novels with these hand-illustrated covers with Fabio with his hair blowing in the wind and nuzzling into a girl's neck and smelling her. That is what the first third of this movie is going for. But it works. It doesn't feel cheesy. Doesn't feel obvious. It doesn't feel like it's appealing to the lowest common denominator, probably because a lot of the dialogue feels very sophisticated. I imagine that a lot of the dialogue was at least borrowed from or kind of like loosely adapted from the novel in question, but having not read it, I can't say for sure. And another aspect I really appreciated was how both the characters played by Jacob Elordi as well as Margot Robbie suffer from a variety of very intense character flaws. Like, while Jacob Elordi might be a brute who can barely speak and barely read, like obviously he's attractive, but he's very much a work in progress when he's taken into this family. But Margot Robbie's character, she's just, even though the family is rapidly running out of money due to her father's gambling debts, she's a little princess and expects everybody to kind of constantly do as she says when she tells them to do so. And she looks upon Heathcliff more like a pet as opposed to like a sibling, because they grew up together, but there's never any question about where he stands in the class system. And as he enters adulthood, he becomes a servant. He's not a member of the household. He's not going to inherit any wealth if there's any wealth left over. He definitely just becomes a part of the working class that is working there at the family estate. And so even though the character of Kathy is completely and totally smitten with Heathcliff and obsessed with him and totally in love with him, she also feels like it would be totally ruinous if she were to give her heart to him, marry him, etc. and so forth. And so oftentimes she inflicts cruel and unusual punishment upon him, both kind of emotionally and psychologically and mentally, and he in turn will eventually do the same, because at a certain point, for people who don't know, Heathcliff, he vanishes in the middle of the night. He rides off into the sunset on a horse and returns years later once Kathy is happily married and settled down. Heathcliff now, for reasons that they have not fully explained in the context of the movie, is now fabulously wealthy. And he buys the old family home of Wuthering Heights. So he's basically now the neighbor of Kathy, and they resume their turbulent love affair, however, now on much more equal footing, but it's much more complicated because Kathy's expecting a child, and her sister-in-law, Isabella, played by Alison Oliver, is now totally smitten with Heathcliff. And I think the most enjoyable part of this movie for me by far was watching Isabella falling in love with Heathcliff, because Alison Oliver, goddamn, she is fucking brilliant. And people should immediately recognize Alison Oliver from Emerald Fennell's previous movie, Saltburn, but I think she makes a much more memorable impression here, where she's like a little girl in an adult's body where all she does is sit around all day thinking about literature and reading plays by Shakespeare, but she still plays with dolls and feels much more like the daughter of the character Edgar that Kathy is married as opposed to the sister. However, once Heathcliff enters the scene, Isabella, she grows up very quickly and starts developing some very mature adult desires of her own. And that's when things get really, really interesting, because everybody's jealous, everybody's screwing everybody, everybody's betraying everybody. And I would say the movie just keeps getting better and better. I was thoroughly enjoying the second half of the movie because there's just so much relentless and merciless backstabbing going on, and so much heartache, so much betrayal. So I seriously misjudged this movie going into it. The main reason I went was due to my curiosity about this ongoing situation between Netflix and Warner Brothers, because prior to Netflix attempting to buy Warner Brothers, there was a question as to whether or not Emerald Fennell and Margot Robbie would produce this film with Netflix or with Warner Brothers, but Netflix would not commit to a theatrical release at that time, and Warner Brothers would. So for less money and for a smaller budget, Emerald Fennell and Margot Robbie took the movie to Warner Brothers, and now here they are releasing it on Valentine's Day. And if this movie is successful in the theater, it's going to for everybody who is opposed to the acquisition of Warner Brothers by Netflix, and that they think it'll have a negative impact on the theatrical experience and theatrical movie going, and basically just eliminate one of the classic traditional studios. It's going to give them a lot of ammunition, because it'll prove that there are still a theatrical audience for this kind of experience. A big, tragic, epic romance, a period piece, an adaptation of a novel, the kind of movie that so rarely gets made now. But Warner Brothers is still acting like a traditional studio in a lot of ways. They're still making original movies like Sinners and One Battle After Another. They're making original horror movies like Weapons, and they're taking big swings with unconventional adaptations of classic English literature, like with this adaptation of Wuthering Heights. And the big fear is that if Netflix buys Warner Brothers, will all that experimentation and all that classic old school studio filmmaking, will it all go away overnight? And here's my theory. I think Wuthering Heights is going to do just fine, because there's not a woman on planet Earth that I've talked to in the last couple of months that's not planning on seeing it. And if I enjoyed it, I know that some of the brothers or husbands or boyfriends or whatever who get dragged along for the ride, they will end up enjoying the movie more than they expected as well. This movie could conceivably end up seriously overperforming. And I'm not going to say that it's going to sway regulators one way or another to approve this acquisition by Netflix, but it'll definitely be an additional ingredient to the conversation. It'll inform the conversation. It'll prove that, if I had my way, Warner Brothers would remain a standalone entity. Paramount wouldn't get them, Universal wouldn't get them, obviously Netflix wouldn't get them, but obviously David Zaslav, who owns Warner Brothers, wants to sell. And I wish there was some kind of benevolent trillionaire out there who could just swoop in and give him all the money that he thinks he deserves, and just allow Warner Brothers to continue doing what they're doing. Because ever since Mike DeLuca and Pam Abdy took over as the heads of the movie division, they've managed to turn the studio around in a very short time. They went from being one of the most unlucky studios imaginable, with one flop after another, into having an incredible year in 2025. And of all the big studios out there, whether it's Paramount or Disney or Universal or now Netflix, I think at least right now, Warner Brothers is making the most exciting original movies. But getting back to this movie and why I think it's going to be successful is that it delivers something that is very rarely delivered these days in big budget Hollywood movies, and that is steamy romance. And that has been suggested in the trailer. It's not the softcore porn that a lot of people claimed it was going to be. If anything, I was kind of disappointed that it was not the softcore porn that I was expecting, but it delivers that kind of smoldering, intense, passionate love affair that we very rarely see in big budget movies. Because honestly, most big budget movies these days are either made for kids or for people my age, like, in their 40s and 50s, who want to remain kids for the rest of their lives. They feel like roller coasters. They feel like you're still playing with your action figures, and emotionally, they're kind of stunted, and they're kind of juvenile, and creatively, they lack ambition, and they don't have any teeth or any edge of any kind. But this movie, Yeah, it's got some hot and heavy smooching in it, and I guess I got to go into some vaguely spoilerific details to discuss some of the R-rated antics on display in this movie. So if you don't want any spoilers of any kind, bail out now. But I'm basically going to be doing a beat-by-beat breakdown of some of the steamier scenes in this movie. So let's start with the first big one. And in the context of the movie, some people might find it a little tough to believe that Margot Robbie, an actress who's now 35 years old, is playing a naive young girl who knows nothing about like the physical act of love, in spite of living basically on a farm. I'm sure animals are boning, day and night all around her. But there's a scene where she first learns about the physical act of love, where she's looking through the floorboards in this barn. Some of the people who work on the land are getting it on, but not only are they getting it on, they're engaged in some, let's just say, some kinky horseplay, quite literally, because the girl has like a bit and bridle. And anyway, the guy's mounting her, and it gets a little bit randy. But Heathcliff, in his infinite wisdom, decides to shield her from these horribly sordid, perverted, depraved acts. And he kind of comes up behind her and covers her mouth and her eyes so that she can't yell in alarm, nor will she see all the depraved sexual antics on display down below. However, he's more than happy to introduce her to some acts of his own later on when he catches her masturbating to the memories of that scene that she witnessed in the barn. So she's behind some boulder, having some special alone time. And when Heathcliff finds her, he grabs her hand, starts smelling her fingers and sucking on them. I was like, bravo, Jacob Elordi. I admire your technique. I admire your style. Well done. That's exactly what you should do under those circumstances. And then a move that a lot of people will be copying moving forward. I'm sure a lot of girls are going to want to see their men copy this move. All the women have all these kind of laces and straps in all their wardrobe back then. He grabs her by the laces and basically kind of curls her up and is kind of holding her, because they're like a foot apart in height. He's a really tall guy. And kind of lifts her up and starts getting it on with her. I was like, you know what? There can be a lot of girls who think that this is the most romantic thing that they've ever seen on the screen, because Hollywood has been terrified of sex and romance for so long, at least on the big screen. You can always find shows where people are getting it on. But when it comes to movies, once again, most big budget movies are made for an innocent sensibility, PG-13 kids adventure movies, or animation, or whatever the case might be. And so when people see these scenes on the big screen, I think a lot of people are like, you know what? Thank you. This has been missing from movies for a long time, and it deserves to make a return. But the wildest scenes by far are those involving the character of Isabella, played by Alison Oliver. And I don't know to what degree these scenes are implied or inferred in the original text, or if they're actually fully explored, because usually in the tradition of Victorian literature, anything involving a roll in the hay was buried beneath a wall of text to just imply what was going on, as opposed to what was really going on. But this movie just goes for it, because I'll give you the brief version of it. At a certain point, Kathy decides, because she's pregnant and she's married, she can no longer carry on this affair with Heathcliff behind her husband's back. And so she breaks things off with Heathcliff. But Heathcliff decides, well, I need to make her jealous and get some revenge. So he decides that he's going to marry the sister of Kathy's husband, Edgar. And there's a very interesting scene where he sits down with Isabella and says, I'm going to be cruel and heartless and do all this to get revenge on Kathy, and I'm basically going to use you and abuse you. Do you consent to all the above? Do you want me to stop? And Isabella is like, meanwhile, he's like, delicately taking her dress off. And she just keeps kind of nodding and smiling and going along with it. And she becomes totally complicit in his plot for revenge, because Heathcliff is still more or less illiterate. And so he's writing all these letters to try to make Kathy jealous. And Isabella is writing these letters on his behalf. And you can tell she's really getting into it as well. But when they're not writing letters trying to drive Kathy crazy, they indulge in a series of sexual escapades involving some, domination and role-playing. And at one point, somebody comes to the house to visit, and you hear a dog barking, and you hear Heathcliff say, it's only somebody at the door, knock it off, stop barking. But when the door is opened, Isabella is on a chain and a leash in dog mode on all fours, happily panting like a dog. And even when the character of Nellie, who's played by Hong Chow, is totally horrified to see how Isabella's being treated, Heathcliff takes the chain off the wall and says, look, she's free to go. And Isabella continues to want to play the role. Anyway, I was cracking up like a devilish lunatic during these scenes, because I guess there's just something about the character where Alison Oliver's interpretation of the character is so unbridled and so vulnerable, and just so she's holding nothing back. I just found her performance to be absolutely delightful. Like, what's not to love about a girl who spends all of her days reading Shakespeare and classic literature, but by night likes to get it on and play weird, kinky sex games? Like, what are you doing later? Like, give me a call. But I've been ranting and raving quite a bit at this point about all the things that I liked about the movie. Let's talk about some of the ingredients that I disliked, including the performance by Shazad Latif as Edgar. And I should acknowledge my bias because Shazad Latif was part of the show Star Trek Discovery, the beginning of the end of one of the most legendary entertainment franchises in history, but through no fault of his own, he found himself cast in that ridiculous show. And I watched 2 seasons of that show, and obviously that franchise has gotten even worse since then with shows like Starfleet Academy, but I can't help but have negative feelings toward him in anything that he does due to his association or affiliation with Star Trek Discovery. But also, he's just not that interesting of a character, and Edgar is written as a not very interesting character. The interesting character is Heathcliff. He's the one who's got all the all the bad boy energy, so it's just bad luck that he had to play the boring character in what is otherwise a cast of very interesting characters. But my main criticism of the movie is the production design of the household that Kathy moves into once she marries Edgar, where it looks like a weird modern bar that you would find in the bottom of like a skyscraper in Manhattan. I was like, what about this is adding to the story? If anything, it's distracting from the story. And I'm not saying that everything about this movie needed to rigidly adhere to 19th century architecture, but if you're going to have kind of a bizarre, outlandish, over-the-top, highly stylized interpretation of this material, I feel like it should be done with a sense of purpose. And this just felt like modern for its own sake, and it just felt kind of random, and it just felt distracting. And so I was unimpressed by a lot of the production design in the movie. However, the photography of this movie is fucking gorgeous. Let's look up the director of photography for this movie, because Emerald Fennell, you can tell, well, people oftentimes justifiably criticize modern movies for being very dim and very bland and very boring. Emerald Fennell clearly still values the role of photography and telling stories visually, and her cinematographer is Linus Sandgren was her DP. And I'm willing to bet that he also shot Saltburn, but let me just check real quick. He shot Saltburn. So yeah, if you liked his cinematography in Saltburn, then you're probably going to like the look of Wuthering Heights. And my final note would be that the first scene of the movie, which is easily the most shocking and perverse scene of the entire movie, it felt a little bit like it was shocking for its own sake, but it doesn't quite match the tone and the overall approach of the rest of the movie. And I don't mind movies being shocking, depraved, perverted, whatever the case might be. Like, if you want to go to strange and unusual territory, I will happily follow you wherever you wish to go. But when it comes to a consistent stylistic vision for the material, like across the board, it felt a little bit like, almost like Emerald Fennell realizes that there are a lot of people out there who love and adore their Victorian literature, and she wanted to kind of rattle their cages and kind of like shock them with the initial scene, letting them know, this is not your mother's Wuthering Heights, this is not your grandmother's Wuthering Heights, this is my Wuthering Heights. Because we have a scene involving a hanging, but as the title cards are coming up, we don't know it's a hanging. We can just hear a guy going like huffing and puffing. You think it's going to be some screwing, but instead it's a guy choking to death because his neck hasn't broken. So he's running out of air. But like with a lot of people, when they're being hanged to death, sometimes they will get aroused by the experience. So he's getting this big raging hard-on, and everybody out in the crowd is pointing like, oh my God, he's got a boner, blah, 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 blah. And then people all start kind of like groping and massaging, like girls are whipping their tits out and girls are like stroking guys up. I was like, all right, this is different from what I expected, but like, wherever you want to go, I'll gladly watch, just because I have no preconceived notions about what the story should be. I just assume that any book that comes from the Victorian era probably doesn't have a lot of boners and stroking off scenes and that sort of thing. But that initial scene, it just doesn't fit with the rest of the movie. There should have been a lot more depraved, perverted scenes scattered throughout the movie, just to kind of make it feel like it wasn't like trying to get attention for its own sake. But who knows? Maybe other people will feel differently. But anyway, I enjoyed the flick. Like I said before, I think it's Emerald Fennell's best movie yet. And if I had to criticize Promising Young Woman or Saltburn, I think both those movies suffered a little bit where they were so concerned with their message that sometimes they kind of tripped over their own feet, where, message-driven movies tend to ignore everything at the expense of the message. But there's no message in Wuthering Heights whatsoever, even though the movie easily could have taken a Saltburn approach and had one of those kind of eat the rich philosophies and been very critical of the class system and that sort of thing. The movie actually was kind of, if anything, soft pedals a lot of the criticisms of the class structure, because obviously Heathcliff is the hero of the story, but it never feels like one of those like pro-working class kind of defiant movies in any way, shape, or form. So I think Emerald Fennell, what she really wanted was to deliver a movie with a lot of style and a lot of romance and a lot of emotion, and I think ultimately she was successful. So happy Valentine's Day from Emerald, Fennell, Margot, Robbie, and Jacob Elordi. I do think people are going to enjoy this movie. And to all the fellas out there like, no, I don't want to go see this stupid fucking period movie, costume drama, be patient. There's probably a 50-50 chance that you might end up enjoying the movie. And I wish I could say, but you just wait for all like the hardcore, like softcore porn. There is no softcore porn in this movie. So that's all false advertising on the part of the people who've been criticizing the approach of the movie, but they had not yet seen the movie. All they could base their criticism on was the trailer. But for people out there who love their classic Victorian literature, if they hate the movie, more power to you, because there have been many times over the last 50 years of my life where I've hated and despised certain shows and certain movies and what they've done to beloved works of literature that I've absolutely adored. So I feel your pain. I just don't feel your pain when it comes to this text, because I guess one of these days I'll just have to read Wuthering Heights and see for myself. In any case, I think that's all I've got to say about this adaptation. Hope you enjoyed my review. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a very happy Valentine's Day, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.